Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going to dive deep into a really pivotal moment, the United States entry into World War I.
Okay.
Now, I think most people have a sense that the U.S. eventually joined the Allies
Right.
and played a crucial role.
Yeah.
But the path from neutrality to becoming this, key player is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's full of these really compelling shifts and changes. So what I find so interesting and what I really want to unpack with you today is why the U.S. initially chose to just stay out of it. This massive conflict erupting in Europe. And then what exactly happened to so fundamentally change their perspective that they were pulled into the fray. So we'll explore, the reasons behind that American neutrality, the events that were sort of turning points. And then finally, the impact of their involvement, not only in the war, but also on America's own future as a nation.
It's a really transformative period to examine, I think. And to understand why America ultimately intervened, we need to look at a whole bunch of interconnected factors. It wasn't a sudden decision. It was a gradual process, influenced by both dynamics within America and the escalating events, across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
That initial commitment to neutrality wasn't just a default position. It was deliberate, rooted in very specific historical contexts and the prevailing ideologies of the time, particularly, of course, President Wilson.
Okay, so let's dig into that initial neutral stance. Back in 1914, when the Great War, as it was known then, began, President Woodrow Wilson was quite firm about the U.S. remaining neutral. My understanding is that his emphasis was heavily on diplomacy and this idea that the U.S. could be an objective peacemaker. So could you expand on his thinking a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Wilson was a progressive idealist. And in the context of foreign policy, this meant that he genuinely believed in the power of reasoned discourse and international cooperation to resolve disputes. He saw the war in Europe as rooted in these long-standing imperial rivalries and just intricate alliance systems. That, in his view, didn't directly implicate core American interests. And this desire to stand apart from European entanglements had deep historical roots in American thought going all the way back to, George Washington. And his farewell address warning against foreign alliances, there was a strong sense that America was different, that its democratic ideals and geographic separation allowed it to be a moral compass for the world, rather than just another participant in its conflicts.
Right. This idea of America is somehow separate and above the fray. You also mentioned the incredibly diverse population within the U.S. at the time. The early 20th century was a period of significant immigration. How did this demographic reality factor into the neutrality decision?
It's a profoundly important aspect to consider. The U.S. was indeed a nation of immigrants, with huge communities that still held strong ties to their countries of origin, whether those were the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, or the allied nations like Britain and France. Imagine the internal strife if the U.S. were to openly side with one group against the other.
Right.
President Wilson was keenly aware of this delicate social fabric. Maintaining neutrality was seen as a way to avoid alienating large segments of the population, preserve national unity, and prevent the war in Europe from spilling over into domestic American divisions and unrest.
So it wasn't just lofty ideals about America's role in the world. There's also very real and practical concerns about maintaining peace and unity within the United States itself.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the economic picture. My understanding is that the U.S. economy was actually doing quite well at the time. How did the war in Europe, from an economic perspective, present both potential opportunities and risks for the United States, especially in the context of staying neutral?
Exactly. The outbreak of war in Europe significantly disrupted existing global trade patterns. This disruption, in turn, created this substantial vacuum that American industries were very well positioned to fill. American businesses found themselves with the opportunity to supply a whole range of goods, from essential agricultural products and raw materials to manufactured goods, and yes, even armaments, to both sides of the conflict, as long as American ships could navigate international waters with a reasonable degree of safety. This trade generated substantial profits and contributed to the continued growth and strength of the American economy. Therefore, at least initially, neutrality appeared to be the most economically advantageous path, allowing the U.S. to capitalize on the war's demands without incurring the immense human and financial costs of direct military involvement.
Okay, so we have this confluence of factors all pointing towards neutrality. Wilson's belief in diplomacy and America's unique position, the very real concerns about a diverse population potentially fracturing along national loyalties, and then these clear economic benefits of trading with both sides. It seemed like a pretty solid stance at the time. But as we know, history took a different turn. What were some of the first signs that this neutral position was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain?
The erosion of American neutrality wasn't a sudden collapse. It was more like a gradual wearing away, marked by a series of increasingly significant and provocative events that challenged the core tenets of that neutrality. A major turning point, one that really jolted American public consciousness, was the sinking of the British passenger liner RMS Lusitania on May 7, 1915. Now, this wasn't a military vessel. This was a civilian ship that was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland.
And this ship wasn't just carrying British citizens, right? There was a significant number of Americans on board.
Precisely. Of the over 1,200 people who perished in the sinking, 128 were American citizens. The sheer scale of the loss of innocent lives, particularly non-combatants, sent shockwaves of horror and outrage across the United States. It directly challenged the notion that America could remain untouched by the brutality of the European conflict. Now, while it didn't immediately trigger a declaration of war, it undeniably shifted public sentiment against Germany and ignited a fierce debate within the U.S. about the morality and practicality of continued neutrality. In the face of such actions, it forced many Americans to confront the human cost of the war in a very personal way.
I can only imagine the intense public reaction. It must have really shaken the feeling of security and distance from the conflict.
Yeah.
But the U.S. still didn't enter the war at this point. What other factors contributed to the growing pressure? To abandon neutrality and eventually take sides?
Despite the profound impact of the Lusitania sinking, President Wilson remained committed to his policy of neutrality. For a considerable period, he pursued diplomatic channels, attempting to pressure Germany to restrict its submarine warfare. Germany did initially agree to certain limitations on its U-boat attacks following strong protests from the U.S. However, by 1917, the war on the Western Front had reached this bloody stalemate, and Germany, desperate to break the Allied blockade that was severely impacting its economy, made a fateful and ultimately decisive decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare.
And this is a fundamental shift in strategy, wasn't it? It wasn't just about targeting potentially hostile ships anymore. This new policy directly threatened American lives and American commerce on the high seas.
Exactly. Unrestricted submarine warfare meant that German U-boats would target any and all ships sailing in the waters around Britain and France, regardless of their nationality, their cargo, or whether they were passenger or merchant vessels. This was a direct violation of international law, just a blatant disregard for American neutrality. German U-boats began sinking American merchant ships, leading to further loss of American lives and causing significant disruption to American trade and economic interests. This was perceived as a direct assault on American sovereignty and the long-held principle of freedom of the seas, which the United States had historically championed.
So American citizens are being killed. American businesses are being directly attacked on the open ocean. It sounds like the pressure to respond militarily must have become almost unbearable. But there was one final event often described as the tipping point, and you mentioned it earlier, the Zimmermann telegram. For those who might not be familiar, could you walk us through what that was?
Certainly. The Zimmermann telegram truly reads like something out of a work of fiction, but it was a very real and highly consequential event. In January 1917, British naval intelligence intercepted and successfully decoded a secret diplomatic communication sent from the German Foreign Office, headed by Arthur Zimmermann, to the German ambassador in Mexico. This telegram contained a highly audacious, and from the American perspective, utterly unacceptable proposal.
And what exactly did this proposal entail? What did Germany suggest to Mexico? It involved the prospect of Mexico taking action against the United States, didn't it?
It did indeed. The telegram proposed a secret military alliance between Germany and Mexico. In the event that the United States entered the war against the Central Powers, in exchange for Mexico agreeing to join the German cause, Germany promised to provide Mexico with significant financial support and, more crucially, to help Mexico recover territories that it had lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War of the mid-19th century, specifically the states of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico.
Wow, so Germany was not only attacking American interests on the seas, but was also actively trying to incite a war on American soil. By encouraging Mexico to reclaim significant portions of the southwestern U.S., that's an incredibly provocative and hostile act. How did the American public and the Wilson administration react when the contents of this telegram became public knowledge?
Outrage is almost an understatement.
Sure.
The public revelation of the Zimmermann telegram in late February and early March of 1917 ignited a firestorm of public anger and indignation across the United States, coming as it did on the heels of the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the continued sinking of American ships. The telegram was widely seen as a blatant act of aggression, a direct and intolerable threat to American security, territorial integrity, and national honor. It effectively galvanized public opinion in favor of war in a way that the earlier events, while deeply troubling, had not fully achieved. It removed almost any remaining doubt in the minds of many Americans that Germany posed a direct threat.
It really does paint a picture of a nation feeling cornered and directly threatened. So with public sentiment having shifted so dramatically and these clear acts of provocation, President Wilson finally made the decision to call for a declaration of war. Can you take us through that pivotal moment? What did he say to Congress? And what was the immediate response to his address?
On April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson appeared before a joint session of the United States Congress and delivered a powerful and truly historic address. In his speech, he eloquently and persuasively argued that the United States had reached a point where it had no viable alternative but to enter the war, to defend fundamental principles such as democracy, freedom of the seas, and American security against the aggressive and lawless actions of Imperial Germany. He famously stated that the world must be made safe for democracy. His speech resonated deeply with a significant portion of the American populace, who now increasingly viewed the conflict not merely as a distant European power struggle, but as a necessary fight for core American values and self-preservation.
And the reaction from Congress was relatively swift, wasn't it? There's debate, of course, but ultimately the decision to declare war was made.
Yes, after several days of intense debate and deliberation. On April 6, 1917, the United States Congress officially declared war on the German Empire. This momentous decision marked a profound and irreversible shift in American foreign policy, effectively ending a long-standing tradition of non-interventionism in European affairs and committing the vast resources of the United States to the Allied cause. The U.S. was no longer a neutral observer. It had become a full and active participant in the First World War.
So the U.S. is finally in the war, joining the Allies who had already been engaged in brutal fighting for nearly 3 years at this point. My understanding is that by this time, the Allied forces were in a pretty precarious situation, facing exhaustion and significant losses. So how did the entry of the United States with its fresh resources and manpower impact the overall course of the war?
America's entry into the war came at a truly critical juncture. For the Allied powers, they were indeed deeply exhausted, having endured immense human and material losses over years of relentless conflict. France and Britain were facing severe economic strain, and their armies had suffered catastrophic casualties. Meanwhile, Russia was on the verge of collapse due to internal revolution and would soon withdraw from the war entirely, a massive blow to the Allied efforts on the Eastern Front. Despite its own significant losses, Germany still appeared to hold a strategic advantage. On the Western Front, the arrival of the United States provided a desperately needed infusion of fresh resources, both material and human, and perhaps even more crucially, a significant and immediate boost in morale. For the weary and demoralized Allied forces, it offered a tangible hope for eventual victory.
It wasn't just about sending over soldiers, was it? The United States also possessed this massive and relatively untapped industrial capacity that could be turned towards war production.
Absolutely. The United States rapidly and effectively mobilized its vast industrial economy for war production. On an unprecedented scale, American factories quickly ramped up the production of essential war materials, including weapons, ammunition, artillery, ships, and a wide array of other supplies that the Allies desperately needed to sustain their war effort. Furthermore, the implementation of a nationwide conscription system, commonly known as the draft, allowed the U.S. to rapidly build a massive army within a relatively short period. Over 2 million American soldiers were raised, trained, and prepared for deployment to the European theater of war. This influx of manpower was critical in offsetting the staggering losses the Allies had already sustained.
And these American forces, when they arrived in Europe, weren't just a symbolic presence, were they? They played a direct and crucial role in the fighting itself. So reading about some key battles, where American troops made a decisive difference.
Yes. The arrival of General John J. Pershing and the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, in France was a pivotal moment in the war. While initially there were discussions about integrating American units directly into existing Allied commands, Pershing insisted on maintaining an independent American command structure. In 1918, as the German army launched its last major offensives on the Western Front, in a desperate attempt to secure victory before the full weight of American power could be brought to bear, American forces played crucial roles in halting these advances. Significant engagements at places like Cantigny, Belleau Wood, and Saint-Mihiel demonstrated the fighting spirit and effectiveness of the American troops, and were instrumental in turning the tide of the war decisively in favor of the Allies. Their fresh energy and unwavering commitment provided the Allies with the strength and momentum needed to launch a major counteroffensive in the autumn of 1918, which ultimately led to the signing of the armistice and Germany's surrender on November 11, 1918.
It really sounds like that injection of American strength and resources was the final push the Allies needed to overcome the Central Powers and bring the devastating conflict to an end. And of course, with the war over, the focus shifted to establishing peace. President Wilson played a significant role in that process, didn't he? Particularly with his 14 points.
Yes. Following the end of the war, President Wilson played a very prominent role in the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and the subsequent drafting of the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war with Germany. He passionately advocated for his 14 points, which he envisioned as a comprehensive blueprint for a just and lasting peace in Europe and the world. These points included principles such as open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, the self-determination of nations, and most notably, the establishment of an international organization known as the League of Nations, which Wilson believed was essential to prevent future conflicts and maintain global peace and security.
And the League of Nations was so central to Wilson's vision for the post-war world. But in a rather surprising and perhaps even tragic turn of events, the United States itself ultimately refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the very organization that its own president had championed. Can you explain the reasons behind this decision?
This is a fascinating and, as you say, somewhat tragic chapter in the story. Despite President Wilson's tireless efforts and fervent advocacy, there was significant and ultimately successful opposition within the United States, particularly in the Senate, to joining the League of Nations. Various concerns were raised, including fears about the potential loss of American sovereignty to an international body, the possibility of being drawn into future European conflicts without the explicit consent of the U.S. Congress, and a general resurgence of isolationist sentiment, a desire to avoid entangling foreign alliances. Ultimately, the U.S. Senate failed to achieve the necessary two-thirds majority to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and therefore the United States never became a member of the League of Nations, a decision that had profound implications for the future of international relations. In the interwar period, this outcome represented a significant setback for Wilson's vision of a new world order based on collective security.
So despite having played such a decisive role in bringing about the end of the war, the United States chose not to join this new international organization that was specifically designed to prevent future conflicts. It seems like a real turning point, perhaps even a missed opportunity. In terms of America's potential global leadership role in the immediate aftermath of the war,
it was indeed a highly significant moment. While the United States did not embrace the role of global leadership in the way that President Wilson had envisioned, in the immediate aftermath of World War I, their involvement in the conflict undeniably marked a major turning point in American history. And in the global balance of power, the nation had definitively transitioned from a regional power, focused primarily on its own hemisphere, to an emerging global superpower with demonstrated economic and military might. The experience of the war had irrevocably altered its relationship with the rest of the world, even as it retreated into a form of political isolationism. The seeds of America's future role as a dominant force in international politics in the 20th century had been firmly planted, even if the full implications of that transformation were not immediately apparent.
So the United States' involvement in World War I is truly a compelling narrative of transformation, from a nation determined to remain neutral, to one whose intervention proved absolutely critical to the outcome of a global conflict. It's fascinating to consider the interplay of ideals, domestic concerns, and escalating international events that led to their initial stance, and then this dramatic series of events that ultimately compelled them to take up arms. It makes you ponder the what-ifs of history. What might the 20th century have looked like if the U.S. had entered the war earlier? Or perhaps not at all. I think the decisions made during that pivotal period about national interest, global responsibility, and the unpredictable nature of history continue to hold valuable lessons for us today. Thank you for navigating this crucial period with me.